And welcome to our learning community talk this afternoon with Delia Pompa, the senior fellow, for education policy at the Migration Policy Institute. As you likely know, I'm Michael Gilligan, the Chief Common Ground Officer for Seek Common Ground. So today, Delia will be talking with us about the role academic assessment plays in the civil rights of English learners. And MPI's assessment, Migration Policy Institute, MPI's assessment of the state of EL assessment. Delia is going to share a brief presentation with us. And after that, I'll have an interview with Delia where I'll incorporate your questions. So please post them in the Q&A function on Zoom. And again, always a plug for you to join us live so that you can have your questions covered. In addition to our formal presentation, which we're currently recording, Delia has given us some time so that we can have an overtime, or as she puts it, after hours. So at the bottom of the hour, we'll stop our formal programming on recording, and we'll shift to a more informal discussion. And those of you who can stay on, we'll bring you up as panelists, so it'll be more of a chat than a webinar. Speaking of talks, we have an upcoming talk with Ian Rosenblum from the US Department of Education to talk about ESSER 3, or as we're calling it, ARPA, the American Relief Plan Act education funding. And that's at 4 o'clock. And we have some additional scheduled talks coming up with Kevin Bogus, one of our project operators in our ARPA Action Accelerator. Kevin will be talking about his experience as a school board member in San Francisco, and sharing his tips and tricks for how to deal with school boards and just his experiences as a school board member. And also that week, we'll be talking with Dr. Pam Cantor, the founder and senior advisor at Turnaround for Children around social emotional learning. And that's July 22nd at 2 p.m. Eastern time. Also, we are continuing to schedule talks. So please post your ideas for who you'd like to hear from in a talk on Slack. So now let me introduce you to Delia, for those of you who don't know her. At the Migration Policy Institute, they are a research organization that does tremendous work around complex immigration policy issues and deal with the local, state, and federal context on these, as well as actually internationally, because of course migration is an international issue. So we are really honored to have Delia share her knowledge, wisdom, expertise with us. And just a little bit of introduction is, I've known Delia for about a decade. We crossed paths when she was at the National Council of La Raza, now known as Unidos US. She was the senior vice president there for programs, and provided me with counsel on advocacy, and I consider her one of my mentors. And she has mentored a tremendous number of folks over the years through her roles at senior roles at the Children's Defense Fund, the Texas Education Agency, Houston Independent School District, as well as a classroom teacher. In addition to her counsel, I have just inestimable respect for Delia as a fierce advocate for children. So with that, just a reminder, we'll have our formal program for 30 minutes and then go to an informal program. And I'll just turn it over to Delia to share her reflections.
Thank you, Michael. And good afternoon to all of you, and thanks for joining me today. I'll be talking about my lifelong work, and that's the education of English learners, 5 million of whom are in US schools today, and probably hundreds of thousands and maybe a million in some of your states. So I think you are familiar with English learners. I'm going to dive a little deeper today. In the short time we have today, I'd like to accomplish 3 things. First, I'd like to familiarize you with a slice of the work we do at MPI, then provide you with perhaps a broader understanding of how assessment and accountability affects English learners. And then finally, help us all think about the policy and community implications of current issues in accountability and assessment that are important to English learners and all children. So Claudia, can we go to the next slide? First, I think it's important that we talk about what's required when we talk about assessment of English learners and accountability for them, because it's a little different than for other students. First of all, English learners are required to participate or have an annual English proficiency assessment. And that's an assessment where you measure how much English a child has learned. Then they also participate in, there's a modified participation, modified in lots of different ways depending on amount of time in school and other questions in the academic assessments that all students take. And then they are full participants in the accountability system, and they are a recognized subgroup within the accountability system. So in general, and I want to talk about the roots in civil rights because they have an important bearing on accountability and assessment for English learners. In general, I would summarize that root as identifying and assessing English learners in a timely, valid, and reliable manner. That is the case for all students, but you'll see that there are very specific implications and very specific mentions in different forms, legal forms, in our educational system. The first one was in a Supreme Court ruling that many of you probably know about in 1974, Lau versus Nichols, in which the court ordered that English learners were required to have meaningful access to the same content as all students. Now that doesn't seem, it seems like that should have been happening, but it wasn't happening. So that Supreme Court ruling is a milestone in the education of English learners. In that same year, those of you involved in policies know that Supreme Court rulings have to be codified, and that ruling was codified in the Equal Educational Opportunities Act, also in 1974. And in the codification, it talked about specific requirements for identifying English learners, because you can't serve them well and ensure they have meaningful access if you don't know who they are. So following that, we had something called the Lau remedies, which many of your states might have been part of, in that there were lots of lawsuits filed around that time using the Lau remedies as a way to get appropriate services for English learners. And the Lau remedies laid out very specific guidance, not only about instruction, but the process of identifying English learners. Since then, we have had a number of changes in the law in ESEA and in different administrative rulings that have taken assessments and higher levels of accountability, have put them in place over the years. And so that's where we are today. So I wanted to talk about this, and the work that brings MPI to this group is related to the impact of the pandemic on assessment and accountability for English learners. And that's the core of our engagement in this group. And that's why I'm so excited to be with you all, because many of you are working on issues of assessment and accountability. And I'm particularly grateful to SCG for bringing us into this group. So let us consider first that the pandemic hit immigrant families and families of English learners particularly hard. And I know you've heard this phrase really often because I keep hearing it, but this pandemic really exacerbated existing inequities. And that's not the case less for English learners, and maybe more for English learners than a lot of other groups. So what has happened to assessment and accountability for English learners because of the pandemic? Well, first of all, there were extended or delayed academic and English language proficiency testing windows. So states generally, as you know, have a period of time where they're testing, doing the academic tests, but they have a different period in which you're doing English language proficiency. The first year of the pandemic, most states had finished their English language proficiency assessment. But the second year, that wasn't the case. And so we have some delays that are providing gaps in information. In some cases, states use shortened assessments of English language proficiency and of academic assessment, so we got less information about English learners. There was some reliance on local assessments, and that has, as you know, a impact on what kind of information you get and how valid that is. An example in terms of what happened in the political aspect, as you know, several states requested waivers from academic assessment. They also wanted waivers from English language proficiency assessment. DC is the only state that was granted the flexibility, as you know, to waive academic assessments, but they did give English language proficiency assessments. What is the bottom line here? The bottom line, if you look at the extended timelines and the shortened timelines and the fact that many, many children weren't tested, is a real imposition on the civil rights of these students, because assessments and accountability are key to identifying English learners, not only for appropriate service, but also exiting from that service if they reach a certain point, when they reach a certain level on both assessments. Then many of the kids did not get identified appropriately, didn't get exited from the program appropriately, and some of the information that's needed for other academic decisions was not available for them. So we had a flurry of calls across states and questions about what do we do about our kids, how do we assess them. A couple of organizations and the department came up with substitutes that you could use, gave ideas for using local assessments. And I have to say, lots of districts and states made a real effort to make sure there was some systematic way of assessing these kids so they would know that they were identified appropriately or exited appropriately, but that didn't take place really the way we wanted. So Claudia, if you go to the next slide, do we know what that impact is? One of the ideas that I want to discuss with you today that I think as a group we need to discuss at some point is how little data exists right now and what the gaps are because of tests that weren't given and accountability systems that can't be put in place the way they're meant to because of the gap in information. So first of all, let's start with the fact that there was very little or misunderstood information for parents about testing and what was happening and what was meant. I would get calls from states saying, our state wants to test these kids and I'm afraid for them to come back in school. These were advocacy groups. The parents don't want to send the kids to school. Other states were calling and saying, are they supposed to test them? Do they have to come back to school? States made different decisions about whether kids needed to go back for testing or not. The testing companies did not have remote assessments. They didn't design any and didn't want to for several validity reasons. So that didn't exist. So that was one effect that we all knew was happening. We didn't know though about how many students were being tested really. We had some ideas from some of the testing companies. We had some ideas about whether the students' proficiency dropped because of the lack of instruction, but we didn't know. Right now, we're starting to see data come out from the states. In addition to the data that we have from the testing companies, states are putting this information in their ARP plans. Some of them are releasing it. Not all the states have released that yet. So right now, we don't know how many fewer students were identified across the board, and we don't know how many fewer students were reclassified who needed to be reclassified. So on to the next slide. In addition to that, for students who were tested, there are a number of issues around validity. We don't know what standards were taught. We don't know whether they were remote or hybrid. Again, states are starting to provide this information in their plans, but we don't have it all. Now, this one is important to the modalities and particularly important for English learners because there were several studies that showed children of immigrants or English learners had less access to the internet, had less access to digital products, digital machines, I was going to call them. We don't call them machines anymore. Had less access to computers and iPads and things that they could use to participate in assessment and, in instruction. So we were concerned about that, but we don't know the real numbers. Also, because a lot of these students are overrepresented when it comes to poverty, low parent education, we don't know the opportunity to learn standards that went along with that, what kind of devices they had. They might have had phones rather than iPads. They might have had pads instead of computers. We don't know about how much access they had to the internet, whether there were parents at home or adults at home to supervise them, because these are low-income parents for the most part. Many work 1 or 2 jobs. They're not there when school's going on. So that was an issue. Also, we don't know how many hours they were getting of instruction or days of instruction. Again, the context of the tests were important when you look at the test. Some of the states did attempt to have remote assessments. We don't know totally whether the tests were in person or remote. We don't know about the shortened tests. We're starting to get that information. We also don't know about participation by English learners, by immigrant students, poor students. That kind of information is just starting to come out, and I don't know that we're going to get as much as we want. So these issues around what the results that we do have what they mean is something we're going to have to start to parse through and to look at. And it is a real concern for the future learning of these kids, because as I said, going back to the phrase, this pandemic just exacerbated and showed the inequities that already existed. And so we need to, as organizations who do research, who do some advocacy, start looking at what does this data mean? Where do we get this data? And what implications does that have to policy? So if you'd go to the next slide, Claudia. What are some of the implications? I mentioned some earlier. Many English learners who were just entering school were not identified appropriately for service. Students who were ready to exit from EL status were not exited because of the assessments. Calculating not only academic growth, but English language proficiency growth is going to be very difficult. There are going to be gaps in that, and we don't know how accurate it is. We don't know from the opportunity to learn indicators that I spoke of earlier, what implications that had for their learning and where the learning gaps are when we're going back to school. Many states and localities had local assessments. We don't know how that plays into the accountability system. English learners are an important subgroup. Their scores are important to overall accountability. So we're looking for policy there. And finally, that communication with parents and community, we know wasn't there. And we do have some policy needs around that. How do we change that for the next pandemic, for the next interruption that looks like the kind of interruption we had with this pandemic? I think it's important for us as groups to think about how we're going to work with communities and families so they know their rights around accountability and assessment, and they know what to ask for. At MPI, that work is taking the form of technical assistance to several community and state groups who work on issues of English learners, and the development of publications that we're going to be happy to share with you once they're done around assessment and accountability. And these would be publications that are accessible to the community and to parents so that they know, what does it mean if my child wasn't tested? What are the implications of that? What should I be asking about? Then the other form that work is going to take at MPI is working with policymakers to collect the right data to inform the right policies. In addition to just getting us going again on the right road in schooling and for these kids, it is going to be good information for us to have as we look forward to a reauthorization and a change in policies within ESEA. Those of us in the field who've been working with English learners have never felt like we've got the accountability right or the assessment right. I think we're learning a lot from this situation about where the gaps are and what needs to happen to fix those gaps. And so I look forward to working with all of you all on these issues, and look forward to hearing your questions, and then also posing some to you as time goes on. So, Michael, I hope I made my timeline all right.
Wonderful. And thank you, Delia. And I'll just, and really thank you for sharing that brief overview. I know it was a brief one, and appreciate you providing it in the context that we set. As Tom has posted in the chat function, please give us your questions in the Q&A function, and I will get to them. And so as your wheels are turning, I'll just ask Delia something around, so I'll just pose this question, which is, from the perspective of English learner families, and you've talked about the civil rights, what are some thoughts you have around the advocacy element or the advocacy component of, like, what should families be advocating for to support their students? What are the tools that that the Lau remedies provide that they should really be thinking about? Some recommendations you have.
Right. Well, the first thing is the civil rights of the parents, I think, and that's the access to the information. As I said, a lot of parents don't have information about what these assessments mean and what the implications are for their kids and what the implications are overall. So getting the information in the hands of parents is important. Then the kinds of questions that I would hope a parent who knows this is able to ask is, was my child assessed? What was that assessment score? How did you make that decision about whether he should enter the program or not? What will he be getting if he enters the program? If you're exiting him from the program, how did you make that decision? What information did you take into account? When it comes to curriculum, parents need to understand that their child becoming an English learner is not necessarily setting him aside, and because a lot of parents think, oh, they're not going to get access to, they're not going to learn the same things. They're not going to learn English. I want them to learn English. And if parents have all the information, they're able to understand that programs for English learners are not to hold them back from what everybody else is learning. They're a route to be able to allow those children to learn what everybody else is learning while they're learning English. And so asking those questions about, what books is my child reading? Where is he in math? Does he have the same thing other students have? Really being able to look at whether the child is getting access to the same content that all children get access to.
I'm going to try and field a couple of questions that are coming in from folks. So one, and I'm framing it this way, is the system didn't work for all English language parents, as it didn't work for so many people. As you pointed out, the existing inequities were exacerbated by the pandemic. How do we, and this is again your counsel, how do we not revert to a system that didn't serve people well? How can we be forward-looking around implementing some forward-looking instruments?
The first thing is collecting the right data that tells us what actually did happen and what didn't happen. So understanding how many days children were out, was absenteeism really high? What kind of instruction were they receiving? Do we have information about whether students who were not attending were scoring lower than children who did attend? If they're not, then you have to wonder whether children who are coming to school are getting the right information. Do we have to improve the communication between schools and parents? Did we as a community get all the information we needed? Did teachers have the kind of training they needed to provide the appropriate instruction for kids? So all of this data sort of comes in to tell us what happened, sort of a forensic examination of what happened. And once we know what happened, I think that arms us with the information to say, okay, so how do we fix it? What do we do different? So one, that doesn't happen again, or what do we do different to make it better afterwards?
Thank you for that. I'm sure that we'll have some questions around that in our overtime session. So again, a plug for people to stay on if you can and continue the discussion with Delia. Here's another question. This is actually a plug for your measurement, assessment, and accountability project, which is how are you developing information and materials for families and for advocacy groups that support families around this? What's your process? What is, how are you looking at the content that you think is important?
Sometimes I think information about accountability and assessment is like this black box. We have a lot of information and policy. People who work in the system know about it and get into all these nuances, but it's not accessible to parents. One of the, I think, saddest, one of the moments we missed as a field is when we started talking about standards and assessment. We didn't bring the public along, and we didn't bring parents along. They didn't know why we were testing their kids. They didn't know what that meant. They didn't know about standards. So we got a lot of backlash and people saying, well, there's too much testing. I don't want my child tested, when there is a good role for assessment. And so being able to take the black box and take it apart for the community and for parents is part of our process. That means in addition to presenting the information in an accessible format, whether that is the native language or just simpler language than the jargon that we educators use, or whether that means making it accessible in bite-sized chunks so people have the information as they need it and understand what's happening as it's needed, is I think what our process is, getting the information out in an accessible form and in a timely form.
And this is a little bit of a follow-up, and then I'll go to a final question, which is, what's the role of school districts, of the system, and what's the role of advocates in providing information and ensuring that information gets into the hands of the English language supportive community?
Well, some of the districts do a really good job of playing their role, which is explaining to the community and parents, what do these assessments mean? What are the implications of the assessments? What can you as a parent do at home? The advocate's role, I think, is, if that's not happening, to go and say, why isn't this happening? Can you tell us what's happening? Can you explain to us what these tests mean? Can you explain to us how our accountability works in our system works in our state, and what the implications are for particular schools and for particular districts? It's asking those questions to be explained to the community in general, so that then they understand what they can advocate for.
And my final question is, who's been someone who influenced you, and why is that?
Oh my goodness, so many people. I think the first person who influenced me was my second grade teacher, and this is not about assessment, it's about who I am. I grew up in San Antonio. I'm Mexican American, and when I was in school many years ago, there weren't a lot of teachers who looked like me, and she was the first teacher I had who was also Hispanic, and who she'd been at Oak Ridge. She had been a scientist before she decided to become a teacher, and through her I learned that I could be anything I wanted. And that was the influence I had. And I think, just a plug for people working on teachers of color and increasing those, it's important.
Thank you for that reflection, Delia. And to those of you who joined us live, if you can, please stay on for the informal overtime discussion. If I see some questions in the chat, we'll get to those then, and we will post some of the discussion in Slack for those of you who are just accessing the recording. So thank you for joining us, and we'll move over to the overtime session.